I stared at the empty birthday card on my kitchen table, the one I'd bought for myself but never sent. 67 years old, and I was still waiting for someone to remember the day I was born. My children had forgotten again, Mara, too busy with her latest business scheme, Eli lost in his music dreams, and Nina buried in her Chicago life. Henry used to handle the birthdays, but he'd been gone a year now, taking with him the last person who seemed to notice I existed. The silence in this house had weight now, pressing down like fog rolling in from Fairgrove's harbor. I'd spent months making excuses for them, telling myself they were grieving too, that they'd come around. But when they showed up last week asking for $20,000, I finally understood. They hadn't forgotten about me. They just decided I only mattered when they needed something. What would you do if the people you'd spent your whole life supporting suddenly treated you like a personal ATM? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains Henry had insisted we keep casting familiar shadows across the kitchen where I'd made coffee for 2 people for 43 years. Now I made 1 cup, and even that felt like too much some days. I picked up his reading glasses from the table. They'd been sitting there since the day he passed, as if he might walk back in and ask what the weather looked like. Fairgrove, Maine, wasn't the kind of place where people disappeared quietly. In a town of barely 3,000, everyone knew when Mrs. Henderson's cat went missing or when the Prescott boy got into trouble at the university. But somehow, my own children had managed to vanish from my life without anyone noticing. Even me at first. I'd raised them in this same house, in this town where everybody knew everybody's business. Mara, my eldest at 42, had been the responsible one growing up, student council president, helped with her younger siblings, always had a plan. Now she lived an hour away in Portland, working as what she called a lifestyle consultant, which seemed to mean she helped wealthy women organize their closets for exorbitant fees. Eli, my middle child at 39, had been the dreamer. Sweet boy with a guitar always in his hands and melodies floating around his head like dandelion seeds. He'd moved back to Fairgrove 2 years ago after his marriage fell apart. Renting a small apartment above Peterson's Hardware, I'd see him. Sometimes at the grocery store, always in a hurry, always with his earbuds in. And Nina, my youngest at 36, had been the smartest of the 3. Straight A's, full scholarship to Boston University, then a master's degree in something with computers that I'd never quite understood. She'd moved to Chicago right after college and built herself a life that seemed to have no room for small-town Maine or the woman who'd packed her lunch every day for 12 years. I understood ambition. I'd had dreams once, too, before Henry's. Antique business needed managing, and before 3 children needed raising, and before life settled into the comfortable rhythm of small sacrifices that somehow added up to an entire existence. I'd kept the books for the shop, balanced our family budget down to the penny, and made sure everyone else's dreams had room to grow. The antique shop sat empty now, its windows dark. We'd closed it 2 years before Henry passed, when his arthritis made it too hard to move the heavy furniture, and my own energy wasn't what it used to be. The building belonged to the Riverside family, and they'd been patient about finding new tenants. But I knew they'd want to do something with it eventually. This house, those house, was mine. Henry had made sure of that, bless him, paid off the mortgage 10 years early by taking on extra refinishing work and skipping the vacation we'd planned to take for our 30th anniversary. Sophie, he'd said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. I want you to have something that's yours, no matter what. I hadn't understood then why that mattered so much to him. Now, sitting in the kitchen with his empty coffee cup still in the dish drainer, I was beginning to see his wisdom. The phone used to ring constantly in this house. Mara calling with updates about her divorce proceedings. Eli needing advice about work or money or the general direction of his life. Nina checking in with efficient 10-minute conversations that covered weather, health, and current events in that order. The phone had been my lifeline to their worlds, proof that I still mattered in their daily calculations. After Henry's funeral, the calls had slowed to a trickle, then stopped almost entirely. I told myself they needed space to grieve. I told myself they were busy, that life had gotten complicated for all of us. I told myself a lot of things that first few months. Sitting in this kitchen and waiting for the phone to ring, my sister, Ruth, bless her heart, had tried to warn me. She'd driven up from Boston for Henry's funeral and stayed a week. Watching me make excuses for children who couldn't be bothered to help plan their father's service. Sophia, she'd said on her last morning, folding her clothes with the precise movements that reminded me why I'd always felt a little scattered around her. You've spent so much time being their safety net that you've forgotten how to live without them needing you. I'd bristled at that, defended them the way I always did. Mara was dealing with her own grief, I'd explained. Eli had never been good with emotions, even as a child. Nina processed things differently, more privately. I had an excuse for each of them, polished smooth from years of use. Ruth had given me a look that I recognized from our childhood. Ah! The one that meant she was going to say something I didn't want to hear but needed to know anyway. What happens, she'd asked, when you need them to show up for you? I'd laughed it off then, made some comment about being fine on my own, about not needing to be anyone's burden. But Ruth's question had planted itself in my mind like a seed, growing quietly through the long, silent months that followed. The first birthday I spent alone was Henry's, 3 months after the funeral. I'd bought a small cake from Meridian's bakery, the kind with thick white frosting that he'd always loved. I'd set a place for him at the table and lit a single candle, feeling both ridiculous and heartbroken. None of the children called. Mara sent a text the next day, "Hope you're doing okay, Mom, thinking of you." But it felt hollow, obligatory. My own birthday had been worse. 67 years on this earth, and the only acknowledgement had come from the bank's automated system and a card from my dentist's office. I'd sat in this kitchen that evening eating leftover meatloaf and wondering when I'd become so easy to forget. The holidays had been the hardest test. Thanksgiving arrived with an invitation from Mara that felt more like charity than inclusion. "You could come to us this year, Mom, if you want. Just casual." When I'd asked about Eli and Nina, she'd gotten vague. You know how they are with family stuff. Christmas had been worse, a group text suggesting we keep things low-key this year, followed by radio silence when I'd asked what that meant. I'd spent Christmas Day watching old movies and eating soup from a can. Telling myself this was just a phase. That grief affected everyone differently. That next year would be better. But next year had brought more of the same. The phone stayed silent. My mailbox held bills and advertisements, but no letters from Chicago or Portland. The casserole dishes I'd lent out during those first months after Henry's death came back unwashed. If they came back at all, it was Connie Mercer who'd finally made me see what was happening. Connie lived next door and had been watching my slow disappearance with the sharp eyes of a retired nurse who'd seen plenty of people fade away from loneliness. "Sophia Slovak," she'd said one morning in March, peering at my back door with a pot of coffee and an expression that brooked no argument. "You're going to waste away in that house if you don't start living again." I'd protested, naturally. That was fine. I'd insisted. Just adjusting to life without Henry, which was perfectly normal and nothing to worry about. But Connie had a way of cutting through nonsense that reminded me why she'd been such a good nurse. "When's the last time one of those children of yours called just to see how you were doing?" she'd asked. I'd opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't remember. Weeks, months, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. That's what I thought Connie had said, not unkindly. "Now, you're going to come with me to the community center tomorrow. They need someone to help with the accounts for the senior lunch program, and you've got 40 years of bookkeeping experience going to waste." That conversation had marked the beginning of something I hadn't expected. A slow careful rebuilding of my life that didn't revolve around waiting for other people to remember I existed. It would be months before I understood how much I'd needed that wake-up call. And even longer before I realized that my children's absence was about to become the very thing that saved me. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in late September, almost exactly 1 year after Henry's passing. I was sitting at the kitchen table, going through the community center's receipts for their monthly lunch program work that Connie had connected me with and that I'd come to genuinely enjoy. There was something satisfying about making the numbers line up, about ensuring that every dollar donated went exactly where it was supposed to go. When the landline rang, I nearly knocked over my coffee cup. It had been so long since anyone had called that house phone that I'd almost forgotten we still had one. The caller ID showed Mara's number. Mom. Her voice sounded bright artificially, cheerful in the way that meant she wanted something. How are you doing? For a moment, I was so surprised to hear from her that I almost fell back into our old patterns, rushing to reassure her that everything was fine. Asking about her life, filling the silence with questions designed to keep her on the line a little longer. But something held me back. Maybe it was the months of silence that had preceded this sudden interest in my well-being. Maybe it was the memory of spending my birthday alone while she posted pictures of dinner with friends on Facebook. I'm managing, I said carefully. It's been a while since I heard from you. I know. Things have been crazy here. You know how it is. The casual dismissal of a year's worth of absence struck me like a physical blow. No, I wanted to say, I don't know how it is. I don't know how you disappear from your mother's life for months at a time and then call like nothing happened. Actually, Mara continued without waiting for my response. I was calling because I have some exciting news. Eli and I are starting a business together. This got my attention. Mara and Eli had never been particularly close as adults. They were too different. Her driven ambition and his laid-back approach to life had clashed more often than not over the years. The idea of them partnering on anything seemed unlikely. What kind of business? I asked. It's a boutique consulting firm, Mara said, and I could hear the enthusiasm building in her voice. Lifestyle and creative services. I'd handle the business development and client relationships, and Eli would provide the creative content music for events, artistic consulting, that sort of thing. There's a real market for it, Mom. People want authentic, curated experiences. I listened as she laid out their plan, which sounded both ambitious and vague in the way that many of Mara's schemes did. She'd always been full of ideas. My eldest daughter. Some had worked her organizing business, had done well for a few years, but others had fizzled out when the initial excitement wore off and the real work began. That sounds interesting, I said, when she finished. How are you planning to fund it? There was a pause, and in that pause, I suddenly understood why my phone was ringing after months of silence. Well, that's actually what I wanted to talk to you about, Mara said, her voice taking on the tone she'd used as a teenager when she wanted to borrow the car. We need some startup capital. Nothing huge, just enough to get established. Maybe $20,000? $20,000. Said like it was pocket change, like it was money I could afford to lose without affecting my own security. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. $20,000 is a significant amount of money, I said slowly. I know it sounds like a lot, but it's really an investment. In the family business, we pay it back with interest, of course, once we're established. You know, we're good for it. Did I know that? No one had either of them paid me back for anything. I thought of the loans over the years, Eli's rent when he was between jobs, Mara's deposit when she moved apartments, the temporary help with car payments and credit card bills that somehow never got repaid. Small amounts individually, but they added up. More importantly, none of them had come with a promise of interest or even acknowledgement that they were debts rather than gifts. I'd need to think about it, I said. Of course. I don't need an answer right now. Mom? Her voice softened, became more intimate. It would mean so much to have your support. Not just financially, but emotionally. It's been such A hard year for all of us. Losing Dad? This feels like a way to honor his memory, you know? He always believed in family, taking care of family. The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced that I almost missed it. The invocation of Henry's memory, the suggestion that refusing would somehow dishonor him. The implication that this was about family loyalty rather than money, it was all there, wrapped in loving language that made it hard to object without seeming cold or selfish. But I wasn't the same woman I'd been a year ago. Months of solitude had given me time to think, to remember who I'd been before I became everyone else's solution. To their problems, community center work had reminded me that I had value beyond my willingness to write checks. I'll need to look at my finances, I said. And I'd want to see a business plan. A business plan. Mara sounded genuinely surprised. Mom, it's us. Kuno, we're not going to waste your money. If you're serious about this business, you should have a plan anyway, I said. Any legitimate investor would want to see one. The word investor seemed to throw her. I could almost hear her recalibrating, trying to figure out why her usually accommodating mother was suddenly talking like a banker. Right? Of course. We're still putting that together. Just wanted to talk to you first. You know, before we approached anyone else. Before they approached anyone else. The implication being that I was their first choice not because they valued my opinion or wanted me involved, but because they thought I'd be the easiest mark. Take your time with the business plan, I said. And I'll take my time considering whether this is something I can support. We talked for a few more minutes after that, but the conversation felt strained. Mara seemed confused by my response, as if she'd expected me to immediately agree and was struggling to understand why I hadn't. When we hung up, I sat staring at the phone for a long time. $20,000. It wasn't money I couldn't afford to lose. Henry had been careful with our savings. And his life insurance had provided a cushion I was grateful for. But it was money that represented security, independence, the ability to handle whatever challenges might come with aging. It was money that could make the difference between staying in this house I loved and having to move somewhere smaller and cheaper if my health declined. More than that, though, it was the assumption that stung. The assumption that I would simply hand over a substantial sum because they were my children, regardless of how they'd treated me. The assumption that I was still the woman who would sacrifice her own security for their convenience. I thought about Henry, about what he would have advised. He's always been protective of our finances, sometimes to a fault. Sophie, he'd said more than once when the children were young adults going through their various crises. We can help them, but we can't save them from themselves. I'd often argued with him about that, accused him of being too hard on them. Now, I wondered if he'd seen something I'd been too close to recognize. The phone rang again that evening. This time, it was Eli. "Hey, Mom," he said, and his voice carried the easy warmth that had always been his gift. "Mara said she talked to you about our business idea. I'm really excited about it." I listened as he echoed many of the same points Mara had made, though with less polished delivery. Eli had always been genuine in a way that Mara sometimes wasn't, but genuine didn't necessarily mean responsible. "It's a chance for me to finally do something with my music," he said. "Real professional. Work, not just playing at the coffee shop on weekends. And working with Mara, I think we could really build something." "What's your experience with business, Eli?" I asked. "Well, I've been freelancing for years. I know how to work with clients, manage projects, okay? And Mara's the business expert. That's why we make such a good team." I wanted to point out that driving for Uber and occasionally playing gigs hardly constituted freelancing experience. But I held my tongue. Instead, I asked, "Have you considered what happens if the business fails? How would you pay back the loan?" "It's not going to fail," he said with the confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about money because someone else always caught him when he fell. "But if something happened, we'd figure it out. We always do. We always do." Meaning, I always did. I was the one who'd figured it out when his marriage fell apart and he couldn't make rent. I was the one who'd figured it out when Mara's organizing business hit a rough patch and she needed help with her credit card payments. I was the one who'd been figuring it out for years while they lived their lives secure in the knowledge that Mom would always be there to catch them. I need to think about it, I told Eli just as I'd told Mara. Sure, but Mom, hope you'll consider it. This could really change things for us. After he hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my kitchen, not bothering to turn on the lights. Change things for them? Not for us, for them. Even in their pitch for family business, I was still just the bank, not a partner. I thought about the past year, about the silence that had surrounded me like fog. I thought about the birthdays and holidays spent alone, about the community center, work that had given me purpose, about Connie Mercer's friendship that had reminded me I was worth knowing. I thought about Ruth's question, what happens when you need them to show up for you? Now I knew the answer. When I needed them, they disappeared. But when they needed me, the phone started ringing again. The realization settled over me like a cold wind off the harbor. My children didn't love me. They loved what I could do for them. And for the first time in my life, I was going to have to decide whether that was enough. The business plan arrived by email 3 days later, a 10-page document that looked professional at first glance, but fell apart under scrutiny. I printed it out and read it twice. A bookkeeper's eye-catching the gaps and inconsistencies that enthusiasm couldn't paper over. Revenue projections that seemed pulled from thin air. Market analysis that relied heavily on phrases like growing demand and untapped potential without any supporting data. A financial breakdown that somehow required $20,000 for startup costs and initial marketing, but provided no itemized list of where that money would actually go. It was the kind of business plan that might fool someone who wanted to be fooled, but it wouldn't survive 5 minutes with a real investor. I set the pages aside and called the number for Fairgrove First National, where I'd banked for 30 years. Margaret Hartley had been handling business loans there since before I'd started, keeping books for Henry's shop, and she agreed to meet with me that afternoon. Sophia, she said when I settled into the chair across from her desk, I was so sorry to hear about Henry. How are you holding up? Was the kind of question I'd learned to answer carefully. It's too much honesty invited pity. Too little invited assumptions that I was fine when I wasn't. I'm managing, I said. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. My children have asked me to invest in a business venture, and I'd like your opinion on their proposal. Margaret's expression shifted into professional mode as I handed her the business plan. She read it carefully, occasionally making notes in the margins, her face giving away nothing. What's your gut feeling about this? She asked when she finished. Honestly, feels like they did enough research to sound credible, but not enough. To actually succeed, I'd agree with that assessment, Margaret said. The financial projections are optimistic to the point of fantasy, and there's no real market analysis. More concerning, there's no backup plan. What happens if they can't book enough clients in the first 6 months? What's their plan for scaling? How do they handle competition? I nodded, feeling both vindicated and sad. So you wouldn't recommend it as an investment? Not based on this, Margaret said. But that's not really the question, is it? This isn't about whether it's a good business investment. It's about whether you want to give your children $20,000. She was right, of course. Business plan was window dressing. What they really wanted was a gift, not a loan. The question was whether I was willing to give it. Can I ask you something? Margaret said. When's the last time any of them asked how you were doing financially? Whether you needed anything? The question hit harder than I'd expected. They haven't, I admitted. Do they know about your financial situation, your expenses, your income? What you might need for healthcare down the road? No, I said quietly. They've never asked. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Sophia, you've been managing money longer than most people have been alive. You know that financial security isn't just about having money, it's about having enough money for whatever comes next. At your age, $20,000 isn't just $20,000. It's part of your cushion against the unexpected. I left the bank with Margaret's words echoing in my head. She was right about the money being more than just its face value. But she was also right about something else. This wasn't really about the business plan. It was about something much more fundamental. That evening, Connie appeared at my back door with a bottle of wine and the expression of someone who had something to say. "I saw Margaret Hartley at the grocery store," she said without preamble. "She mentioned you'd been in to discuss some kind of investment." I should have been annoyed that Margaret had shared our conversation, but Fairgrove was a small town and Connie was my closest friend. Privacy had different rules here. "My children want money for a business," I said, opening the wine and pouring 2 glasses. "Ah," Connie said, settling into the chair that had become hers over the past few months. "And let me guess, this is the first you've heard from them in how long?" "Months," I admitted. "Of course it is." Connie took a sip of wine and fixed me with a look that had probably intimidated countless patients over her nursing career. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I said, and realized as I said it that this was the first time in years I'd admitted to not knowing something when it came to my children. Usually I had ready answers, automatic responses designed to smooth over problems and keep everyone happy. "Good," Connie said. "Not knowing means you're actually thinking about it instead of just doing whatever they want." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the late afternoon light filter through the kitchen windows. Finally, Connie spoke again. "Do you know what I think?" she said. "I think they've forgotten that you're a person with your own needs and wants. You've been so busy being their mother that they've forgotten you're also a Sophia woman with her own life to live." Oh. The truth of that settled into my bones. When had I stopped being Sophia and become just mom? Not a person, but a role. Not an individual, but a function. "I've been thinking about that volunteer coordinator position at the community center," I said, surprising myself. Evelyn Torres had mentioned it to me the week before, suggesting I might be interested in helping organize their programs. I demurred, claiming I was too busy. But the truth was, I hadn't been sure I was ready for that level of commitment. "You should do it," Connie said immediately. "You're a natural organizer, and they need someone who understands budgets and logistics. It would mean being out of the house more," I said. "Making commitments that aren't flexible. So what? If they need me, what if something happens?" Connie set down her wine glass and leaned forward. "Sophia, when your husband was dying, where were they?" The question was like a slap. Henry's illness had been brief, but intense. A heart attack followed, by complications that kept him in the hospital for 2 weeks before he passed. I'd spent every day at his bedside, going home only to shower and change clothes. "Mara came for the last few days," I said defensively, "and Eli was dealing with his own stuff. Nina flew in for the funeral." "For the funeral?" Connie repeated. "Not for you. It's not to help you through the hardest thing you've ever faced. For the funeral." I wanted to argue, to make excuses the way I always did, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. During the worst crisis of my life, I'd been, essentially, alone. They'd appeared for the public parts of the service, the burial, the reception, but they'd been absent for the private devastation. The daily reality of watching the man I'd shared my life with slip away. "They have their own lives," I said weakly. "Do you?" Connie replied. "Or you could, if you stopped waiting for them to give you permission to live it." That night, after Connie left, I sat at the kitchen table with the business plan spread in front of me. All right. But instead of reading it again, I found myself thinking about the volunteer position at the community center. What would it mean to say yes to something for myself, instead of constantly saying yes to things for other people? I thought about the senior lunch program, where I'd been helping with the books. The participants weren't just clients, they were becoming friends. Margaret Chen, who shared recipes and stories about her grandchildren in San Francisco. Robert Mills, who'd lost his wife the same year I'd lost Henry, and understood the particular weight of an empty house. Janet Fuller, sharp wit, reminded me that aging didn't have to mean becoming invisible. These people saw me as Sophia, not just as someone's mother or wife. They valued my opinions, appreciated my skills, included me in their lives not because they needed something from me, but because they enjoyed my company. The phone rang as I was getting ready for bed. Nina's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering. My youngest daughter called so rarely that seeing her name made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Mom?" Her voice was crisp and professional, the way it always was. "I heard about Mara and Eli's business proposal." "Did you?" I said carefully. "I wanted to warn you about something," Nina continued without waiting for my response. "I looked into their market analysis, and it's basically nonsense. The lifestyle consulting industry is oversaturated, especially in Maine. There's no way they'll generate the revenue they're projecting." I wasn't surprised that Nina had done her own research or that she'd found the same flaws I had. What surprised me was that she was calling to warn me rather than to encourage me to support her siblings. "I appreciate you looking into it," I said. "Mom, I know you've always helped them out when they needed it, but this is a lot of money. You should think about your own future, your own security." It was the most concern anyone in my family had, shown for my well-being in months, and coming from Nina, who rarely showed concern for anyone. It felt both validating and sad. "I am thinking about it," I said. "Good, because honestly, they're adults. They should be able to fund their own business ventures by now." After we hung up, I realized that Nina's call, meant to be helpful, had actually clarified something important. Even she saw me primarily as a source of financial support for her siblings, rather than as a person whose own dreams and goals mattered. Her advice to protect my money wasn't about protecting me. It was about preventing Mara and Eli from accessing resources that she apparently thought should be preserved for some unspecified future use. None of them saw me as someone with my own plans, my own aspirations, my own right to choose how to spend both my time and my money. But I was beginning to see myself that way. The next morning, I called Evelyn Torres and told her I was interested in the volunteer coordinator position. Then I called Margaret Hartley and asked her to help me set up a proper financial plan, not just for managing what I had, but for using it to support the life I wanted to live. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what other people needed from me. And it felt like waking up. The community center position turned out to be exactly what I didn't know I needed. 3 mornings a week, I found myself in a bright office, overlooking Fairgrove's small downtown, coordinating programs that brought real value to people's lives. Senior exercise classes, after-school tutoring, financial literacy workshops, grief support groups. They're kind of practical, meaningful work that reminded me why I'd always loved organizing and planning. Evelyn Torres had been right about my skills, being a good fit. Within a month, I'd streamlined their volunteer scheduling system and created a budget tracking spreadsheet that actually made sense. More importantly, I'd found myself part of a community that valued what I brought to the table. "Sophia," Evelyn said one Thursday morning in late October, "I've been thinking about expanding our programming. There's real interest in more financial education classes, especially for single mothers and people nearing retirement. Would you consider teaching a workshop series?" The suggestion surprised me. I'd been content to work behind the scenes, managing logistics and keeping track of details. The idea of actually teaching, of being the person people turned to for guidance, felt both exciting and terrifying. "I don't know if I'm qualified to teach," I said. "I just kept books for a small business." "But you kept books for 40 years, Evelyn pointed out. "You managed a household budget through raising 3 children and putting them through college. You understand money in a way that a lot of financial advisors don't." From the perspective of someone who's actually had to make it stretch. That afternoon, I drove home thinking about Evelyn's offer. Teaching would mean putting myself forward in a way I'd never done before. It would mean claiming expertise, taking up space, being visible. These were things that the old Sophia, the one who'd spent decades smoothing over problems and making herself smaller so other people could be bigger, would never have considered. But the new Sophia, The one who was slowly emerging from a year of silence and reflection. Found the idea intriguing. I was pulling into my driveway when I noticed Eli's car parked on the street. He was sitting on my front porch, guitar case beside him, looking like he'd been waiting for a while. "Hey, Mom," he said as I approached, his smile uncertain. "I hope it's okay that I just stopped by. I was in the neighborhood." Ella was never in the neighborhood unless he had a specific reason to be. His apartment was on the other side of town, and his usual haunts the coffee shop where he sometimes played. The bars where he met friends were nowhere near my street. "Course," I said, unlocking the front door. "Come in. I'll make some coffee." We settled in the kitchen, and I noticed how he looked around as if seeing the space for the first time. Had it been that long since he'd been here? I tried to remember his last visit and realized it had been before Henry's funeral. "The place looks good," he said. "Different, somehow." I followed his gaze and saw what he meant. Over the past few months, I'd been making small changes. Henry's reading glasses had finally been moved to a drawer. I'd rearranged the living room furniture to better catch the morning light. New plants sat on the windowsills, and the walls displayed some community center artwork I'd purchased at their fall fundraiser. The house still felt like home, but it no longer felt like a shrine to a life that was over. "I've been making some updates," I said simply. "It's nice," Eli said, though he sounded a little sad. "More like you, if that makes sense." We talked for a while about neutral things, the weather, his music, my work at the community center. He seemed genuinely interested in what I was doing. They're asking questions about the programs and the people I'd met. It was the longest conversation we'd had in months, and I found myself relaxing into it. Then he shifted in his chair, and I knew we'd reached the real reason for his visit. "Mom, I wanted to talk to you about the business thing," he said. "I know it's been a few weeks since we first brought it up, and I'm wondering what you're thinking." "I'm still considering it," I said, which was true, though perhaps not in the way he hoped. "I get that it's a big decision," he said, "but I wanted you to know that this isn't just some pin-the-sky idea for me. This could really be my chance to make something of myself, to finally turn my music into something sustainable." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There was something in his voice that caught my attention, a vulnerability I hadn't heard since he was young. Eli had always been the dreamer, but he'd also always been the one who seemed most confident that things would work out somehow. Hearing him admit to uncertainty, to really wanting something, softened my heart in a way I hadn't expected. "Tell me more about that," I said. "About what success would look like for you." He leaned forward, his eyes lighting up in a way that reminded me of the boy who used to play his guitar for me in this same kitchen. "I've been thinking about it a lot," he said. "Real success, not just getting by. I want to write music that matters, Not just background music for coffee shops, but songs that actually connect with people. And working with Mara, I could reach clients who appreciate that kind of thing. Weddings, corporate events, private parties, places where music can really make a difference." I listened as he talked about his vision, and I heard something I'd missed in our previous conversations: genuine passion mixed with a growing understanding of how the world actually worked. This wasn't the boy who'd always expected someone else to handle the practical details. This was a man who'd started to think seriously about his future. "That sounds wonderful," I said when he finished. "How much of this have you discussed with Mara?" "Some of it," he said, though his expression suggested there was more to that story. "She's focused on the business development side, client acquisition, revenue streams, that kind of thing. And you're comfortable with that division of labor?" Eli was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee. "Honestly, I'm a little worried that she sees this as her business with me as hired talent. But I figure once we get started, we can work out the details." The naivety of that statement hit me like a physical blow. 40 years of bookkeeping had taught me that the time to work out details was before money changed hands, not after. Partnership agreements, profit sharing, decision-making authority, these weren't details to figure out later. They were the foundation that determined whether a business succeeded or collapsed in acrimony. Have you talked about a partnership? Agreement? I asked. About who owns what percentage of the business? How decisions get made? Mara said we'd handle all that legal stuff once we get funded, Eli said. She's got a lawyer friend who can draw up whatever we need. Mara's lawyer friend. Mara's business plan. Mara's vision of client development. I was beginning to see the real structure of this proposed partnership, and it wasn't the collaborative venture Eli imagined. Eli, I said carefully, what happens? If you and Mara disagree about the direction of the business? Who has the final say? We won't disagree, he said with the confidence of someone who'd never been in business with a family member. We want the same things. I thought about the relationship I'd observed between Mara and Eli over the years. She was the older sister, who'd learned early that she could manage her younger siblings by taking charge and making decisions for them. He was the younger brother who'd learned that going along with Mira's plans was easier than fighting for his own vision. It had worked fine when they were children, but it was a terrible foundation for a business partnership. But pointing this out would mean crushing the hope I saw in his eyes. And I wasn't sure I had the heart for that. Not yet. I think you should. Talk to Mara about getting the partnership details worked out before you approach any investors. I said instead. Any serious business person is going to want to see that you've thought through the structure. Yeah, you're probably right, Eli said, though he didn't sound convinced. Mara handles all that business stuff better than I do. There it was, the assumption that had probably doomed this venture before it started. Eli saw himself as the creative talent and Mara as the business expert, but from what I had observed, Mara's business expertise consisted mainly of enthusiastic networking and polished presentations. The actual work of building sustainable systems, managing cash flow, and making hard decisions when things went wrong, those skills required experience that neither of them had. Have either of you considered starting smaller, I asked? Oh, maybe. Testing the concept without needing such a large investment. What do you mean? Well, you could start by booking a few small events. See how you work together? Figure out what clients actually want. Build a track record. That way, when you do approach investors, you have real data to show them. Eli looked thoughtful. That's not a bad idea. I mean, we could probably book some smaller gigs pretty easily. And it would give us a chance to work out the kinks. Exactly. And it would require a much smaller initial investment. Maybe a few $100s for marketing materials instead of $20,000. I watched something shift in his expression. Not disappointment, exactly, but a recognition that this practical approach wouldn't give him the dramatic life change he'd been hoping for. Starting small meant continued uncertainty, continued financial struggle, continued dependence on other people's support while he slowly built something sustainable. Starting small meant growing up. And I wasn't sure Eli was ready for that. I'll talk to Mara about it, he said, though his enthusiasm had clearly dimmed. After he left, I sat in the kitchen thinking about the conversation. Part of me wanted to give him the money not for the business, but simply to see him happy, to support his dreams the way I'd always done. The mother in me wanted to smooth over his difficulties and make his path easier. But the woman. I was becoming understood that ease wasn't always kindness. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do was let someone face the natural consequences of their choices. That evening, I pulled out Henry's mother's recipe box, a wooden chest filled with handwritten cards that had been gathering dust in our pantry for years. Eleanor Slovak had been a formidable cook, and her recipes had fed our family through countless holidays and celebrations. After she passed, I'd kept making a few of her standards, her apple pie, her pot roast, her famous dinner rolls, but most of the recipes had been forgotten. Now, looking through them, I saw an opportunity. These weren't just recipes. They were family history, community tradition, the kind of knowledge that deserved to be shared rather than hoarded. I thought about Evelyn's suggestion that I teach financial literacy classes. What if I expanded that idea? What if I offered a series of workshops that combine practical skills budgeting, meal planning, household management with the kind of traditional knowledge that was disappearing from modern life? The idea excited me in a way that surprised me. For years, I'd been the person who quietly handled details while other people got credit for the big picture. But what if I stopped being quiet? What if I claimed my expertise and shared it with people who could actually benefit from it? I spent the evening copying out recipes and making notes about lesson plans. By the time I went to bed, I had the outline. For a 6-week workshop series, Practical Wisdom, Life Skills for Real People. Budgeting and meal planning, home organization, basic financial planning, and yes, cooking from scratch using ingredients that didn't cost a fortune. It felt like the beginning of something entirely new, not just a volunteer position or a way to stay busy, but a genuine contribution that came from my own knowledge and experience for the first time in months. I fell asleep excited about the future rather than haunted by the past. The revelation came, as most revelations do, by accident. I was cleaning out Henry's desk in early November, finally ready to sort through the papers and files he'd accumulated over decades of running his business. Most of it was routine old tax returns, supplier catalogs, records from furniture sales that had happened years ago. But buried in the bottom drawer, found a manila folder labeled Family in Henry's careful handwriting. Inside were bank statements I'd never seen before. Not our joint account, not the business account, but statements for a savings account Henry had opened in his name alone. The account dated back 15 years, and as I read through the monthly statements, a pattern emerged that made my stomach clench with recognition. Deposits, regular deposits, always in round numbers. Always shortly after phone calls from the children about emergencies, crises, opportunities that required immediate financial help. I sat in Henry's chair, spreading the statements across his desk like pieces of a puzzle I was afraid to solve. The timeline was clear. Every time I'd given one of the children money over the past 15 years, Henry had quietly replaced it from his own earnings. The loan to Mara for her divorce attorney. The gift to Eli when his band's equipment was stolen. It's the investment in Nina's graduate school education that we'd supposedly pulled from our retirement. Savings, none of it had come from our joint accounts. All of it had come from money Henry had been setting aside, without my knowledge, specifically to cover what he'd apparently seen as my inability to say no to our children's financial requests. The final statement was dated just 2 months before Henry's death. The account balance was 0. Every penny had been transferred to our joint savings in a transaction labeled for Sophie. I stared at that last entry until the numbers blurred through my tears. Henry had known that I couldn't refuse our children. And instead of confronting me about it, instead of insisting we set boundaries, he'd quietly protected our real savings by creating a shadow account to fund my generosity. How much had he sacrificed to maintain this system? How many extra hours had he worked refinishing furniture? How many vacation plans had he abandoned? How many small pleasures had he denied himself to ensure that I could continue being the mother I thought I needed to be? And what did it say about me that he'd felt the need to hide this from me at all? I thought about all the conversations we'd had over the years about money, about the children's requests for help, about our retirement planning. Henry had never been controlling about finances. We'd made decisions together, discussed major purchases, planned for the future as a team. But apparently, when it came to the children, he'd been fighting a one-man battle to protect our security, while allowing me to maintain my illusions about affordable generosity. The phone rang, jolting me out of my thoughts. Mara's number appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering. But the weight of what I'd just discovered made me pick up, if only to hear her voice through this new lens of understanding. "I'm so glad I caught you," she said, her voice bright with the particular enthusiasm that usually preceded a request. I wanted to give you an update on the business planning. Eli and I have been working so hard on this, and I think you're going to be really impressed with our progress. I looked down at the bank statements spread across Henry's desk. 15 years of proof that my children's enthusiasm for projects had consistently outpaced their ability to fund them. That's nice, dear, I said, hearing how distant my own voice sounded. We've been talking to potential clients, and the response has been incredible. There's so much demand for what we're offering. In fact, we might need to revise our initial funding request upward. It's maybe $30,000 instead of $20,000. $30,000? An increase of 50%, delivered as casually as if she were talking about ordering extra appetizers for a dinner party. I see, I said. I know it sounds like more money, but it's really about setting ourselves up for success from the beginning. You know what they say, you have to spend money to make money. I thought about Henry, working late into the evening, in his shop, sanding and staining pieces of furniture that would sell for modest profits. I thought about the vacations we'd never taken, the restaurant meals we'd skipped, the small economies we'd practiced so that there would always be something left over for the children's emergencies. Mara, I said, how much money do you think I've given you and your siblings over the years? The question seemed to catch her off guard. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I said. If you had to estimate the total amount of financial help I've provided to you, Eli, and Nina since you became adults, what would that number be? There was a long pause. I don't know, Mom. I've never really thought about it that way. I mean, we're family. Family helps each other out. Take a guess, I said. I really don't know. A few thousand? Look, Mom, I don't understand why we're talking about ancient history. Is this about the future? About giving Eli and me a chance to build something real? What? A few thousand. The casual dismissal of what I now knew had been tens of thousands of dollars over the years, money that Henry had quietly replaced from his own earnings. Money that had shaped every financial decision we'd made as a couple. I need to ask you something, I said. In all the time you've been planning this business, have you considered any funding sources other than me? Well, of course, we've thought about other options. But bank loans are complicated, and investors want all kinds of guarantees your family. You believe in us. Have you actually applied for a bank loan? Talked to any real investors? Mom, you know that traditional funding sources don't understand creative businesses. They want boring stuff like collateral and credit histories. Credit histories, the phrase hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Because, of course, a bank would want to see credit histories. It'd want to know how potential borrowers had handled financial obligations in the past. They'd want evidence of responsibility, of follow-through, of the ability to manage money effectively. All things that Mara apparently knew she couldn't provide. I have to go, I said abruptly. I'll call you later. I hung up before she could respond and sat staring at the evidence spread across Henry's desk. Not just the bank statements, but the larger pattern they revealed. My children hadn't approached me about this loan because they believed in family businesses or thought I'd be a good investor. They'd approached me because they knew if I was the only person naive enough to give them money without asking hard questions about payback plans or credit histories. They'd approached me because I was, in their calculation, the easiest mark. That afternoon, I drove to Margaret Hartley's office at the bank. I brought Henry's secret file with me. I need you to help me understand something, I told Margaret, spreading the statements across her desk. My husband apparently maintained a separate account that I didn't know about. Can you help me figure out why? Margaret studied the documents carefully, her banker's eye tracking the patterns of deposits and withdrawals. When she looked up, her expression was gentle but clear. It looks like he was protecting your primary savings from charitable impulses, she said diplomatically. My children's requests for money, you mean? It appears that way. Yes, I thought about all the times Henry and I had discussed the children's financial situations. His reluctance to help that I'd sometimes interpreted as hard-heartedness. His suggestions that we should let them figure things out on their own that I dismissed as lack of empathy. He hadn't been hard-hearted, he'd been realistic. And he'd loved me enough to let me maintain my illusions, while quietly ensuring that our actual security remained intact. Margaret, I said, I want you to be completely honest with me. Based on these patterns, how much money do you think I've actually given my children over the years? She did some quick calculations, factoring in the account deposits and what she knew about the timing of various family crises. Conservatively, probably $60,000 to $70,000. $60,000 to $70,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. That was more than the down payment on our house. More than Henry's life insurance policy. More than many people made in an entire year. And how much of that was ever repaid? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Based on these records, none of it. I drove home through the late afternoon light, thinking about the weight of that number. $70,000 in gifts disguised as loans, in help that was never reciprocated, in support that had apparently been taken so much for granted that my children couldn't even estimate its magnitude. But more than the money, I thought about what it represented. A lifetime of teaching my children that I existed to solve their problems rather than as a person with problems of my own. A lifetime of demonstrating that my resources were available to them unconditionally while their resources were never available to me. I thought about the months of silence after Henry's death, about the birthdays and holidays spent alone, about the phone that only rang when they wanted something. I thought about Henry, working those extra hours to replace money I'd given away, never complaining, never making me feel guilty, quietly ensuring that my generosity wouldn't destroy our security by the time I pulled into my driveway. I'd made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to say no, not just to this loan, but to the entire system that had turned me into a bank rather than a mother. I was going to set boundaries that honored Henry's sacrifice and my own worth as something more than a solution to other people's financial problems. The question was whether I had the courage to follow through. The weekend before Thanksgiving, I made a series of phone calls that felt like preparing for battle. First, I called Ruth in Boston and told her about Henry's secret account, about the bank statements, about my growing understanding of how much I'd been taken for granted over the years. "Oh, honey," she said, and I could hear both sadness and validation in her voice. I wondered if something like this was going on. Henry was always so careful about money, but you were always so generous with the children. I couldn't figure out how you made the math work. "You've never said anything," I pointed out. "Would you have listened if I had?" She was right. Of course. I'd been so invested in being the mother, I thought I should be endlessly giving. Always available, never demanding anything in return, that I dismissed any suggestion that this dynamic might be unhealthy. "What are you going to do?" Asked. "I'm going to tell them no," I said, and saying it out loud made it feel more real. Not just about the loan, but about the whole arrangement. "I'm done being their backup plan." "Good for you," Ruth said. "It's about time." Next, I called Connie and asked if she wanted to come over for dinner. Not because I needed advice, I'd made my decision, but because I wanted to practice saying the words with someone who would understand. Connie arrived with a bottle of wine and the kind of listening ear that came from decades of helping people. Through difficult conversations, I found out something about Henry, I said, and told her about the secret account, about the bank statements, about the pattern of deposits that had subsidized my children's financial irresponsibility for 15 years. "That man loved you more than you knew," Connie said when I finished. "And he was smarter than any of us gave him credit for." "I feel like such a fool," I admitted. "All those years I thought I was being a good mother, teaching them that family supports family. I was just teaching them that I was a pushover." "You were being the mother you thought you should be," Connie corrected. "There's a difference between being a fool and being loving. The problem isn't that you loved them, it's that they took advantage of that love." We talked for hours about family dynamics and boundaries, about the difference between helping and enabling, about what it meant to love someone enough to let them face the consequences of their choices. "Are you nervous about the conversation?" Coney asked as we were cleaning up. Terrified, I admitted, but also, relieved. Like I've been holding my breath for years and I'm finally going to exhale. The next morning, I called Mara and asked her to bring Eli for dinner on Sunday. "I want to discuss your business proposal," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "That's wonderful, Mom." Mara's enthusiasm was immediate and intense. "I'll bring our updated business plan. You're going to love what we've put together." After I hung up, I spent the morning preparing for what I knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I set the table with my good china, not because I was celebrating, but because I wanted to treat myself with the respect that I'd been giving away too freely for too long. I cooked Henry's mother's pot roast, using one of the recipes from the box I'd been exploring. It felt appropriate somehow, honoring the memory of a woman who'd been known for speaking her mind and standing her ground. Sunday afternoon arrived, gray and drizzling. Typical November weather in Maine. Mara and Eli showed up together, both carrying folders and wearing expressions of eager anticipation. They hugged me hello, and I noticed how their embraces felt different, now warmer and more attentive than they'd been in months. Amazing how the prospect of money could improve their affection. "Mom, this smells incredible," Eli said as we settled around the dining room table. "I haven't had Grandma Eleanor's pot roast in years. It's one of her recipes," I said. "I've been going through her box thinking about family traditions." We ate and made pleasant conversation about their drive over, about the weather, about the community center's upcoming holiday programming. They were both being particularly charming, asking about my volunteer work, complimenting the meal, showing interest in my life in a way that would have thrilled me 6 months ago. Now, knowing what I knew about Henry's secret account and their casual dismissal of the money I'd given them over the years, their attentiveness felt calculated rather than genuine. After dinner, Mara pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Mom, I'm so excited to show you what we've put together," she said, spreading papers across the table like a salesperson making a pitch. "We've really taken your advice to heart about being more thorough. The new business plan was certainly more polished than the first version. Color charts, market analysis that looked like it had been copied from legitimate sources, financial projections that had been refined to look more credible. But reading it with my new understanding of their track record, I could see that it was still fundamentally fantasia, pretty package around a concept that had no foundation in reality." "This looks very professional," I said when they finished their presentation. "We've also talked to that lawyer friend I mentioned," Mara continued. "She says she can draw up all the partnership paperwork once we get funding secured. And we've started reaching out to potential clients," Eli added. "There's definitely interest in what we're offering." I looked at my children, my adult children sitting at the table where I'd served them thousands of meals over the years. Mara, confident and persuasive, still believing that enthusiasm could substitute for experience. Eli, talented and hopeful, still believing that someone else would handle the difficult parts. "I have some questions," I said. "Of course," Mara said. "We want you to feel completely confident in this investment." "First," I said, "have either of you ever run a business before?" "Well, I had my organizing business," Mara said. "Which you closed after 2 years," I pointed out. "Why did that fail?" Mara's confident expression flickered slightly. "Didn't fail, exactly. I just decided to pursue other opportunities." "What other opportunities?" "The consulting work I'm doing now?" "Lifestyle coaching. It's more flexible." "And how much income does that generate?" "It varies," Mara said, clearly uncomfortable with the direct questioning. "Some months are better than others." I turned to Eli. "What about you? What's your current monthly income?" "Mom," Eli said, looking confused by the direction of the conversation, Why are we talking about this? You know, we wouldn't be asking for help if we didn't need it. I'm asking because any investor would want to know about your financial track record, I said. How much money do you make in an average month? How much do you spend? How much do you have in savings? The silence that followed was telling. These were basic questions that any serious business discussion would include. But they clearly hadn't expected to be asked them. We don't have a lot of savings right now, Mara finally admitted. That's why we need startup capital. I see, I said, and when you pay back this loan, where will that money come from? From the business profits, Eli said, as if this were obvious. But according to your own projections, you won't turn a profit for at least a year. How will you live during that time? How will you pay your personal expenses? More silence. What happens if the business doesn't generate the revenue you're projecting? I continued. What's your backup plan for repaying the loan? Mom, Mara said, and her voice had taken on an edge I recognized from her teenage years. You're treating this like we're strangers asking for a bank loan. We're your children, we're family. You're also adults asking for a significant amount of money, I replied. And family or not, that deserves serious consideration. I stood up and walked to the sideboard where I'd placed a manila folder of my own. Inside were copies of Henry's bank statements, printouts from my conversation with Margaret Hartley, and a handwritten summary of every financial emergency I could remember helping with over the years. I want to show you something, I said. Returning to the table with the folder, I spread out the documents explaining about Henry's secret account, about the pattern of deposits that had replaced every penny I'd given them over the years. Then through the timeline, the amounts, the cumulative impact of their requests for help. According to my calculations, I said, I've given the three of you approximately $70,000 over the past 15 years, none of which has ever been repaid. Mara and Eli stared at the papers, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock to something that might have been shame. Mom, Mara said finally, we never asked you to keep track of every little thing you helped us with. Every little thing. I repeated. $70,000 is not little things, Mara. That's more than most people make in a year. That's more than your father's life insurance policy. But you never said those were loans, Eli protested. You said you wanted to help. You said family supports family. I did say that. I agreed. And I meant it. But support is supposed to go both ways. When did either of you ever offer to help me? When did you ask if I needed anything? When did you treat our relationship as anything other than you asking and me giving? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with years of unexamined assumptions. After your father died, I continued, I didn't hear from either of you for months. No phone calls, no visits, no questions about how I was managing. But the minute you need money, suddenly you're concerned about family loyalty. We were grieving too, Mara said defensively. We lost our father and I lost my husband of 43 years. I said, but somehow my grief didn't excuse me from being available when you needed something. Eli looked stricken. Mom, we didn't. Realize, ... I mean, we thought you were doing okay. You always seem so strong, so capable of handling everything. I am capable, I said. But capable doesn't mean I don't need support. It doesn't mean I don't get lonely or worried or overwhelmed. It just means I've learned not to expect help from people who only call when they want something. I could see them processing this, trying to reconcile their image of me as the endlessly giving mother with this new version, who was asking them to examine their own behavior. So you're saying no to the loan? Mara said, her voice flat. Saying no to continuing a relationship where I give and you take and we pretend that's normal, I said. If you want to start a business, find investors who aren't related to you. Apply for bank loans. Do the work that actual entrepreneurs do instead of expecting your mother to fund your dreams. But we're family, Eli said, and his voice cracked slightly. Family helps each other. You're right, I said. Family does help each other. but help goes both ways. When you're ready to have a relationship where you give as much as you take, where you're interested in my life as much as your own, where you show up for me the way I've always shown up for you, then we can talk about what family really means." The silence that followed was profound. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of the harbor bell that marked the changing tides. Finally, Mara stood up, gathering her papers with sharp, angry movements. "I can't believe you're doing this," she said. "We're your children. We're not supposed to have to earn your love." "You don't have to earn my love," I said quietly. "But you do have to earn my money. And more than that, you have to earn my respect, which means treating me like a person whose feelings and needs matter, not just a bank account with maternal instincts." Eli stood too, more slowly, looking lost and confused. "Mom," he said, "I don't understand. What do we have to do? How do we fix this?" It was the first question either of them had asked that gave me hope. "You start by figuring out how to solve your own problems," I said. "And then maybe you start calling just to see how I'm doing. Not because you need something, but because you care about the answer." They left quietly, without the hugs or promises to call soon that usually ended our visits. I watched their car disappear into the November dusk and then sat in my living room, surrounded by the silence that had become my most constant companion. But for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful, like the quiet that comes after a storm has passed and the air has finally cleared. I had done what I needed to do. Now I would see what came next. The phone started ringing Tuesday morning. Not my landline Miraz number, lighting up my cell phone screen with the persistence of someone who couldn't accept that a conversation was actually over. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again by noon, there were 6 missed calls. And for text messages, each more urgent than the last. "Please call me back. We need to talk. I think there was a misunderstanding Sunday. This is ridiculous. We're family. Fine, be that way. But don't blame me when Eli falls apart." The last message was the one that almost broke my resolve. The suggestion that I was somehow responsible for Eli's emotional stability, that my refusal to fund their business venture would cause him genuine harm, was manipulation so familiar I could have written the script myself. For 40 years, I'd been dancing to that tune. Every family crisis, every financial emergency, every moment when one of my children needed something had been framed as a test of my love, my loyalty, my worthiness as a mother. And I'd passed every test by opening my wallet, by rearranging my life, by making myself smaller so they could be bigger. But I was done with that dance. Wednesday brought a different approach. Nina called from Chicago, her voice crisp with the professional efficiency she used for difficult conversations. "Mom, Mara told me about your dinner on Sunday," she said without preamble. "I think you might have overreacted. Did I?" I said, settling into the kitchen chair where I'd had this same conversation with myself 100 times over the past few days. She said, "You brought up money from years ago. Money that nobody ever treated as loans. That seems unfair." "What seems unfair to me," I said, "is that none of you can even estimate how much financial help I've provided over the years. $70,000, Nina. Do you understand what that represents?" "I understand that you're upset about Dad's secret account," Nina said, her tone softening slightly. "But that's not Mara and Eli's fault. They didn't know about it anymore." "Then you did. You're missing the point," I said. "The account is just evidence of a pattern where I give and you take, and we all pretend that's how families work." "But it is how families work," Nina protested. "Parents help their children. That's normal." "Children also help their parents," I pointed out. "When's the last time you offered to help me with anything? When's the last time you called just to see how I was doing?" There was a pause. When Nina spoke again, her voice was more careful. "I'm calling now," she said. "You're calling to advocate for your sibling's business loan," I corrected. "That's not the same thing." Mom, I think you're being unfair. Yes, Mara and Eli should have stayed in better touch after Dad died. But they're not bad people, and this business could really help them get their lives together. At what cost to my life? I asked. To my security. To my peace of mind? It's just money, Nina said, and the casual dismissal hit me like a slap. No, I said, my voice harder than I'd meant it to be. It's not just money. It's my independence. It's my ability to handle whatever comes next: medical bills, home repairs, long-term care if I need it. It's the security your father worked his entire life to provide, and that he protected even when I was too naive to protect it myself. You're being dramatic, Nina said. $20,000 isn't going to make or break your financial security. 30,000, I corrected. Mara increased the request. And your right tit probably wouldn't break me financially. But it would break something else. My sense of self-worth. My belief that I matter as something other than a source of funding for other people's dreams. I don't understand why you're making this so complicated, Nina said, frustration creeping into her professional composure. They're your children. Do you help them? That's what parents do. What do children do? I asked. In this arrangement where parents always give and children always take, what are the children's responsibilities? To be grateful, I guess, to make good use of the help they receive. And have they? Made good use of the help I've given over the years? Silence, Nina, I said. You're a smart woman. You understand business. You understand finance. Look at your siblings' track record with money, their own money and mine. Would you invest $30,000 in a business run by people with that history? That's different, Nina said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? 'Cause I'm supposed to lower my standards when family's involved. 'Cause family means never having to be responsible or accountable or grateful. I have to go, Nina said abruptly. Have a meeting. After she hung up, I sat in the kitchen thinking about the conversation. Nina had called to change my mind, but she'd actually reinforced my decision. Even she's the most financially savvy of my children saw my money as somehow naturally available to her siblings. Regardless of their qualifications or track record, the fact that none of them could understand why I might want to protect my financial security said everything about how they saw me. Not as a person with my own needs and vulnerabilities, but as a resource to be managed and accessed when convenient. Thursday brought the full court press. All three of them showed up at my house at dinner time, apparently having coordinated this intervention without consulting me about whether I wanted company. I opened the door to find them standing on my porch like awkward teenagers, Mara holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers, Eli carrying his guitar case, Nina looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. We brought dinner, Mara announced, holding up bags from Chen's kitchen. And we want to talk. I could have refused them entry. Should have, probably. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see how they'd handle this conversation when they couldn't retreat to their separate lives. We spread the Chinese food across my kitchen table. And for a few minutes, it almost felt normal. Like any family dinner where we caught up on each other's lives and shared the comfortable rhythms of people who'd known each other forever. Then Mara cleared her throat. Mom, we've been talking, she said, and we think there's been a miscommunication about the business loan. Have we? I said. We want you to know that we've never taken your generosity for granted, Eli added. We appreciate everything you've done for us over the years. And we understand that you're concerned about our business plan, Nina said. We're willing to address those concerns. I looked at my three children, all of them wearing expressions of earnest sincerity, and realized that they'd planned this conversation like a negotiation. They thought this was about the specific details of their current request rather than about the fundamental dynamic that had shaped our relationships for decades. What would you like me to address first? Mara asked, pulling out her phone. We've made notes about ways to make the business plan more robust. I don't want you to address anything, I said. I want you to listen. They exchanged glances, quick, confused looks that suggested this wasn't the response they'd prepared for. "'Kay," Eli said carefully. "We're listening." "When your father died, I began. I expected you to rally around me. Not because I couldn't handle things on my own, but because that's what families do during crises. They show up for each other." "We did show up," Mara protested. "We all came for the funeral." "For the funeral," I repeated. "One day out of an entire year of grief. We thought you wanted space," Nina said. "You always seem so independent." "Am independent," I said. "But independent doesn't mean I don't need support. It doesn't mean I don't get lonely or scared or overwhelmed. It just means I've learned not to ask for help from people who aren't interested in giving it." "That's not fair," Eli said. "We would have helped if you'd asked." "Would you?" I asked, "'cause I never had to ask you for money. You always came to me when you needed financial help, but I had to ask for emotional support." "It's different," Mara said. "You're the parent. You're supposed to be the strong one." "According to who?" I asked. "According to some rule that says parents exist to serve their children, but children have no obligations to their parents." "We have obligations," Nina protested. "We love you. We care about you, do you?" I asked. "When's the last time any of you asked about my health, my happiness, my plans for the future that don't involve funding your plans?" The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of questions they couldn't answer. "I'll tell you when," I continued. "Never. In all your adult lives, you've never asked what I want for myself. You've never wondered if I have dreams that don't revolve around being useful to you." "What do you want?" Eli asked, and his voice was small. "What dreams?" was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for months. What did I want beyond the negative space of not being taken for granted? "I want to teach," I said, surprising myself with this certainty in my voice. "I want to share what I've learned about managing money in households and life. I want to matter to people who value my knowledge rather than just my bank account." "You could still do that," Mara said. "The loan wouldn't stop you from teaching." "But it would stop me from feeling good about myself," I said. "It would mean that even after everything I've realized about our relationship, I still couldn't say no to you. It would mean that I matter less than your comfort, your convenience, your assumption that I'll always be here to solve your problems." "So, what are you saying?" Nina asked. "That you're cutting us off, that we're not family anymore." "I'm saying that family is supposed to be reciprocal," I said. "It's supposed to involve people who care about each other's well-being, not just people who care about what they can get from each other." "We do care about your well-being," Mara insisted. "Then prove it," I said. "Go 6 months without asking me for anything. 6 months of calling just to talk, visiting just to spend time together. Showing interest in my life that has nothing to do with what I can provide for yours. And then you'll give us the loan," Eli asked. The question broke my heart a little because it showed that he still didn't understand. Even now, in the middle of a conversation about taking rather than giving, he was focused on what he could get from me. "Then we'll see if we have a relationship worth rebuilding," I said. Mara stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're punishing us for treating you like a mother instead of a stranger." "I'm asking you to treat me like a person," I corrected. "Like someone whose feelings and needs matter as much as yours do." "Fine," Mara said, gathering her purse with sharp, angry movements. "You want to play hardball? You want to make us jump through hoops to prove we love you? Fine. But don't expect us to keep trying forever." She left through the front door, letting it slam behind her. Nina followed more quietly, pausing only to say, "I think you're making a mistake, Mom, but I hope you know what you're doing." Eli lingered, his guitar case clutched in his hands like a security blanket. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry about not calling, about not being there when Dad died. I didn't know you needed us. I shouldn't have to tell you that I need you," I said gently. "It's just like you don't have to tell me when you need help. The difference is I pay attention to your needs. I notice when you're struggling. I wish you'd notice when I am. "I'll try," he said. "I'll do better." "I hope so," I said, and meant it, after they left. I cleaned up the remains of our dinner and sat in my living room processing what had just happened. The conversation had gone both better and worse than I'd expected. Better because Eli, at least, seemed to understand that something needed to change. Worse because Mara and Nina still saw my expectations as unreasonable rather than as basic human dignity, but I'd said what needed to be said. I'd drawn the line that should have been drawn years ago, and I'd done it without anger, without cruelty, without the kind of ultimatums that burn bridges permanently. I'd simply told them the truth, that I was a person deserving of consideration, not just a resource to be exploited. Whether they could hear that truth, whether they could change the habits of a lifetime, remained to be seen. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like myself. Not Mom, the endless giver, not Sophie, the accommodating wife, but Sophia. Woman with her own worth, her own boundaries, her own life to live. It felt like freedom. Christmas came and went without the usual flurry of obligatory phone calls and last-minute plans. For the first time in decades, I spent the holiday exactly as I chose, making Eleanor's cinnamon rolls for the community center's Christmas morning, breakfast for seniors, attending midnight mass at the little stone church where Henry and I had been married, and reading by the fire with a cup of proper English tea and the new mystery novel Ruth had sent from Boston. It was peaceful in a way that surprised me. I'd expected to feel lonely or guilty or some combination of both. Instead, felt something I hadn't experienced in years, contentment that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or presence. The community center Christmas breakfast had been my idea, suggested during one of the volunteer coordination meetings in early December. Too many of our senior participants spend the holidays alone. I'd told Evelyn Torres. What if we offered them a place to come together? Nothing elaborate, just good food and company for people who might not have anywhere else to go. The response had been overwhelming. We'd expected maybe 20 people and ended up serving breakfast to 43 seniors, plus a handful of volunteers who stayed to share the meal and conversation. Margaret Chen had brought homemade dumplings that disappeared within minutes. Robert Mills had entertained everyone with stories from his 30 years as Fairgrove's mail carrier. Janet Fuller had organized an impromptu gift exchange using small items people brought from home, nothing expensive. Just thoughtful tokens that said, "I see you, I value you, you matter." Sitting at a table with these people who'd become my chosen family, I realized something profound. I was happier in that community center dining room than I'd been at any family. Christmas and years, the difference was reciprocity. These people cared about my well-being not because I could solve their problems, but because they genuinely enjoyed my company. When Margaret asked about my holiday plans, she was really listening to the answer. When Robert complimented the cinnamon rolls, he was acknowledging the effort I'd put into making something special for people I cared about. When Janet suggested we make the Christmas breakfast an annual tradition, recognizing that I'd contributed something meaningful to their community, it was the kind of appreciation I'd been craving for my children without realizing its acknowledgement that I was a person worth knowing, not just a resource worth accessing. January brought the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones and stay there, but it also brought something unexpected. A call from Eli. "Hey, Mom," he said, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard in years. Nervous, but genuine. "I was wondering if you'd like to have lunch sometime, just to talk." No agenda, no business plans, just lunch. I agreed to meet him at Meridian's Caf, the same place where I'd bought birthday cakes for myself and Henry during those long, silent months after the funeral. When I arrived, Eli was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that looked like he'd been practicing what to say. "Thanks for coming," he said as I sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm always willing to talk," I said. "The question is whether you're willing to listen." Kay nodded, accepting the gentle challenge. "I've been thinking about what you said. about not paying attention to what you need. And I realized you're right. I couldn't tell you the last time I asked how you were doing without wanting something. It was a start. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that went deeper than the surface-level contrition I'd heard from him before. "How are you doing?" he asked, and waited for the answer with an attention that felt new. I told him about the Christmas breakfast, about the financial literacy classes I'd started teaching at the community center, about the cookbook project I'd begun using Eleanor's recipes. Simple things, really, but they were my things projects that mattered to me, accomplishments that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or problems. "You sound happy," Eli said, and there was surprise in his voice. "I am happy," I said, realizing as I said it that it was completely true. "Are you happy because we're not in your life as much?" Kay asked, and I could hear the hurt beneath the question. "I'm happy because I'm living my own life instead of waiting for you to need me," I said carefully. "There's a difference." We talked for almost 2 hours, not about money or business plans or family obligations, but about music and community work, and the challenge of figuring out what you want your life to look like when you're not who you used to be. Eli told me about taking a part-time job teaching, guitar lessons to kids, work that paid less than driving for Uber but gave him more satisfaction. I told him about the senior who'd started attending my budgeting classes and had managed to pay off her credit card debt for the first time in a decade. When we parted ways, Eli hugged me goodbye, the quick, obligatory embrace I'd grown used to, but a real hug that lasted long enough to matter. "Can we do this again?" he asked. "Just lunch? Just talking?" "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. February brought a different kind of call. Mara, her voice tight with the kind of control that meant she was furious but trying not to show it. "Mom, we need to talk," she said. "Eli says you've been having lunch together." "We've had lunch once," I confirmed. "Well, I think it's unfair for you to have a relationship with him, but not with me." The entitlement in that statement took my breath away. Even now, months after our confrontation, Mara still thought she could dictate the terms of our relationship based on what she considered fair rather than on what she was willing to invest. "You're welcome to call and ask me to lunch," I said. "That's not the point," Mara snapped. "The point is that you're playing favorites. You're punishing me for being honest about what we need while rewarding Eli for being manipulative." "What I'm doing," I said, "is responding to the effort people make. Eli called because he wanted to spend time with me. You're calling because you're angry that he did. So what am I supposed to do? Pretend to be interested in your little community center projects just so you'll talk to me?" The question revealed everything that was wrong with how Mara understood relationships. She still saw genuine interest in other people's lives as pretense, as a performance designed to get something, rather than as the basic foundation of caring about someone. "I'm supposed to believe you care about my life when you just dismissed everything that matters to me as little projects?" I asked. There was a pause. When Mara spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, more uncertain. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to have a relationship with you that isn't about you helping me with things." It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years. "Then maybe that's where you start," I said gently. "By figuring out who we are to each other when you don't need anything from me. And if I can't figure that out, then we probably don't have much of a relationship to rebuild," I said. The truth of that settled between USAID, but not cruel, final, but not angry. "I'll think about it," Mara said before hanging up. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of hope that seems to rise from the earth itself. I spent my days working in the community garden plot that Connie had convinced me to claim, teaching my expanded workshop series to packed rooms of people eager to learn practical skills, and planning the community cookbook that would preserve Eleanor's recipes alongside contributions from families. Throughout Fairgrove, the cookbook project had grown beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. What started as a way to honor family recipes had become a celebration of the town's culinary heritage. with stories and photographs that captured not just how to make a proper Maine lobster roll, but why these foods mattered to the people who'd been making them for generations. Working on it reminded me daily that there were many ways to leave a legacy. Not just through the children you raised or the money you left behind, but through the knowledge you shared, the communities you strengthened, the connections you helped other people make. On a warm day in late April, I was working in my garden when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. I looked up to see Nina walking toward me, dressed in the kind of casual clothes that suggested she'd planned to be here longer than her usual rushed visits. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Do you have time to talk?" I invited her into the kitchen, noting how she looked around with the same surprised attention Eli had shown months earlier. The house had continued evolving new curtains. That let in more light plants that added life to previously sterile corners. Photographs from community events that replaced some of the old family portraits that had made me sad rather than happy. "You've changed things," Nina observed. "I've changed a lot of things," I said, pouring glasses of iced tea. "Not just the house." "I know," Nina said. "That's what I wanted to talk about. 'Kay?" We sat at the kitchen table where I'd served thousands of meals to my children over the years, but this conversation felt different from all those that had come before. Less like a performance and more like an actual attempt at communication. "I've been thinking about what you said," Nina began, "about family being reciprocal, about asking what you want instead of just assuming you'll give us what we want. And I realized I don't know what you want. I don't know what makes you happy or what you worry about or what you dream about. I know you as Mom, but I don't know you as Sophia." It was an admission that must have cost her something to make. Nina had always prided herself on being observant, analytical, someone who understood systems and patterns. Acknowledging that she'd missed something so fundamental about someone so important must have been genuinely difficult. "What would you like to know?" I asked. We talked for the rest of the afternoon, really talked in a way we hadn't since she was a teenager and still believed her mother might have interesting thoughts about the world. I told her about the satisfaction I got from teaching people skills that could improve their lives. She told me about her work in Chicago, about the loneliness of building a career in a city where she had no roots, about the difficulty of making real friends when most of your relationships were transactional. "I think I learned that from us," she said eventually, "from our family. The idea that relationships are about what people can do for each other, rather than just enjoying each other's company." "Maybe," I said. "But you can learn new ways of connecting. It's not too late to build different kinds of relationships." "Is it too late to build a different relationship with you?" she asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "That depends on whether you want to know me as a person or just repair things enough so you don't feel guilty about how we left them." Nina. It was quiet for a long time, looking out the kitchen window at the garden where late afternoon light was turning everything golden. "I want to know you," she said finally. "I want to understand what I missed. And I want to figure out how to be your daughter without making you feel like an ATM." It wasn't a promise. Nina was too smart to make promises she wasn't sure she could keep. But it was a beginning as summer settled over Fairgrove, bringing tourists and family reunions and the kind of long, lazy days that made everything seem possible. I found myself looking back on the past year with something approaching amazement. I'd lost the family I thought I had, but I'd gained something more precious. The family I'd chosen, the work that fulfilled me, and most importantly, sense of my own worth that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. The community cookbook was published in July with a launch party at the community center that brought together what felt like half the town. Seeing my name on the cover, compiled and edited by Sophia Slovak, gave me a pride I hadn't expected. Not because I needed recognition, but because it represented something I'd built with my own hands. It's my own knowledge, my own vision of what mattered. Eli came to the launch party, bringing his guitar to provide background music and staying afterward to help with cleanup. Mara sent a card, polite but distant, wishing me well but making no promises about future contact. Nina called from Chicago to congratulate me, and for the first time in memory, The conversation felt natural rather than obligatory. Were we family again? Not in the way we'd been before, and maybe that was better. The old dynamic had been built on assumptions and obligations that had served no one well. Whatever we became going forward would have to be based on genuine affection and mutual respect. Some relationships could be rebuilt on healthier foundations. Others couldn't survive the transition from obligation to choice. Both outcomes were okay, I'd learned. The goal wasn't to maintain relationships at any cost, but to maintain relationships that added value to everyone involved. On a warm evening, in late August, I was sitting on my back porch with Connie, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sun set over Fairgrove Harbor. The tourist season was winding down, and the town was settling back into the quieter rhythms that belonged to the people who lived here year-round. Any regrets? Connie asked. In the direct way, that was one of the things I loved most about her friendship. I thought about the question seriously. Did I regret the confrontation with my children? The boundaries I'd drawn? The relationships that had been damaged, perhaps permanently? No, I said, and realized I meant it completely. I regret that it took me so long to stand up for myself. I regret that I taught them to see me as a resource instead of a person. But I don't regret, finally, asking for the respect I should have demanded years ago. Good, Connie said, because you're worth respecting. As autumn returned to Maine, bringing the kind of spectacular foliage that reminded you why people chose to live through the harsh winters. I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a cashier's check for $5,000 and a note in Eli's handwriting. Mom, this is partial repayment for all the help you've given me over the years. It's not everything I owe you, but it's a start. Thank you for teaching me that family means showing up for each other, not just taking from each other. I'm sorry it took me so long to learn that lesson. Love, Eli. I stared at the check for a long time, surprised by how much the gesture moved me. Not because of the money, $5,000 wouldn't change my life, but because of what it represented. Acknowledgement, accountability, a recognition that our relationship had been unbalanced and that he was willing to do the work to change. I deposited the check and used the money to establish a small scholarship fund at the community center, financial literacy classes for single mothers funded in Henry's memory. It felt like the right way to honor both his sacrifice and Eli's attempt to make things right. Winter came early that year, but I was ready for it. My house was warm and welcoming. My work was meaningful. My friendships were genuine. I had everything I needed and most of what I wanted. More importantly, it's something I'd been missing for longer than I'd realized, a life that belonged to me. On Christmas morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own time, with plans that reflected my own choices. I made Eleanor's cinnamon rolls for the community center breakfast, attended church with people who valued my presence, and spent the evening reading by the fire. The phone rang once Eli, calling to wish me Merry Christmas and to tell me about the first paying gig his new band had booked. We talked for 20 minutes about music and holiday traditions and the community center's plans for a New Year's Eve dance. When we hung up, I felt grateful for the progress we'd made and hopeful about the relationship we were building. Nina sent a card with a long handwritten note about her life in Chicago and a genuine question about my cookbook project. Mara sent nothing, which was fine. Some relationships couldn't survive the transition from obligation to choice. And forcing connection where none existed naturally would have served no one. As I settled into my chair by the fire that Christmas night, I thought about the empty birthday card that had started this whole journey, the card I'd bought for myself but never sent. Sitting on this same kitchen table more than a year ago, I was no longer the woman who waited for other people to remember. She existed. I was no longer the woman who measured her worth by her willingness to sacrifice her own security for other people's convenience. I was Sophia, Slovak teacher, friend, community member, woman of worth. I was someone who had learned to say no with grace and yes with intention. I was someone who had discovered that the most loving thing you could do, sometimes, was to refuse to enable other people's irresponsibility. Most importantly, I was someone who had learned that asking people to treat you with basic human dignity wasn't selfish or demanding. It was just being human. And that, I realized, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The fire crackled in the hearth. The harbor bell rang midnight, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of neighbors celebrating the end of one year and the beginning of another. I raised my teacup in a small, private toast to Henry, who had loved me enough to protect our security even when I couldn't protect it myself. To Ruth, who had asked the hard questions that helped me see the truth. To Connie, who had reminded me that I was worth knowing. To the community that had welcomed me, not for what I could give them, but for who I was, and to myself for finally learning that love without respect isn't love at all. And that the most important relationship you can rebuild is the one you have with yourself. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing Fairgrove Inn. The kind of pristine white that made everything look new and possible. I pulled a blanket around my shoulders and settled deeper into my chair, content to watch the world transform itself while I sat safe and warm in the life I'd finally learned to claim. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new choices about how to spend my time and energy and love. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged in my own home. Living my own life, answerable to no one but myself. And that felt like the greatest gift I'd ever received. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.